In the name of God who loves us and calls us to respond. Amen. And calls us to respond. And calls us to respond. Beloved, I am listening for how to respond this morning, right along with you. Because I think it is fair to say, for me at least, that whomever you wanted to win on any level of the election this past week, on any issue or proposition, that the shift in the electorate across much of the country, indeed here in California, was something not only that I didn't see coming, but something I'm still trying to understand. And I want to be in conversation this morning with Scripture, with our bishop and others who have called us to a faithful prayer and posture for the living of these days. And even with some down and counted out folks who somehow seem to want to hope. In our Wednesday morning men's group, we are close to finishing a book by Timothy Keller, founding pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church. He died last year from pancreatic cancer. This book, Making Sense of God. And in the epilogue of the book, Keller reflects on the writings of Langdon Gilkey in his book, Shentung Compound, describing his experience of internment in China following Japanese imperial expansion in the early 1940s. He was interned with about 2,000 people in the size of about a San Francisco city block, wherein he was one of 10 men who shared a cell, each with a bed 18 inches to either side of which and 3 feet at the end of which would be where you could keep anything that you had, any belongings you had. Gilkey himself had embraced humanism in his studies as a magna cum laude philosophy major at Harvard, and soon saw his assumptions about the inherent rationality and goodness of human beings put to the test. He writes of a story after being elected head of the housing committee within their micro-civilization inside the camp. 11 single men were living in a small room, and they discovered that there was another small room of identical proportions in which there were 9 single men living. And as Gilkey went to address this issue, for those of you who may have ever served on your HOA board, he was thankful for something as clean and clear-cut as this. Straightforward. But the 9 residents of Block 49 didn't see it that way. Sure, we're sorry for those chaps over there, but what has that got to do with us? Gilkey tried to rationalize, show them the math, to which one responded, fair or no fair, if you put one of them in here, we are merely going to heave him out again. And oh, by the way, if you ever come back and try to talk to us about this again, we'll heave you out as well. The trouble with his humanism, Keller reflects, was not its confidence in science and technology, but as Gilkey writes, its naive and unrealistic faith in the rationality and goodness of men who wielded these instruments. What he discovered was that all human beings, at some level, were intensely self-interested and selfish, but found the most ingenious ways to cloak those motives in moral and rational language. The thin polish of easy morality had worn off, he writes. In more comfortable settings, people can feign the virtues of justice, compassion, and integrity, but in the compound, to be truly fair and rational, just and generous, required the sacrifice of some precious good. Gilkey found an example and witness to that in Eric Liddell, the 1924 Olympic gold medal winning Scottish runner of Chariots of Fire fame. Liddell would later go back to China. He was born to missionary parents and went back as a missionary. And he was a prisoner in the compound and died during his internment. Gilkey candidly describes how the other missionaries and the clergy in the camp were fully as selfish and ungenerous as the general population, and in many cases more so, because they often accompanied their behavior with sanctimony. Which reminds me to ask, are these robes looking a little bit longer this morning? But Liddell was different. Gilkey makes a startling statement about him. It is rare indeed when the person has a good fortune to meet a saint, but he came as close to anyone as I might have ever known. Liddell was especially concerned to minister to the teenagers in the camp, those without other support structures. He would cook for them, and he would supervise and set up recreation opportunities for them, sports and the like. And if you remember from the story, his Chariots of Fire story, that he refused to run on Sunday, which for him was a Christian Sabbath. But in the camp, he forwent that and even on Sunday would provide meals and recreation. Gilkey says he poured himself out to them. More than anyone else, he was overflowing with humor, love of life, sacrificial kindness for others, and inward peace. I read the epilogue of Keller's book again Tuesday evening, right before our Wednesday morning group. And I found myself giving thanks for Gilkey's writings and for Liddell's witness. I'm not telling you this story because I know the future or have some hot take about internment camps, right? Even as we basically already have different versions of these in our current system with detention centers. I'm telling you this story because I need to be reminded that something I think is true of many of the folks who may have voted differently from me this past election is actually also true of me. And this is the line I read again. What he discovered was that all human beings at some level were intensely self-interested and selfish, but found the most ingenious ways to cloak those motives in moral and rational language. Now, to be fair to our psyches, we are sort of forced to do this in order to cope with life, at least on a very small scale, because we do fail the moral image we hold for ourselves. And the alternative, we know, is much worse when there is no coping left. But I'm brought today feeling called to respond, first by confessing. And I think that confession here is that I have taken for granted the project of ever unfolding liberty, equality, justice, and the like. thankful when a court, as they used to do, or even less often lawmakers, expanded and protected a right for someone I love so that I have less work to do as an ally. I'm going to say that again. That I have taken for granted the project of ever-folding liberty, justice, equality, and the like. Thankful when a court, as they used to, or even less often lawmakers, expanded and protected a right for someone I love so that I have less work to do as an ally. Those days, beloved, by and large, are over. Likely for at least half again as many years of my lifetime. And the project of ever unfolding liberty, equality, and justice and the like, I have to admit, was one I wanted to be like that old infomercial for the Showtime rotisserie, in which Ron Popeil would put a chicken in the rotisserie and tell the audience and everybody watching at home that all you had to do was set it and forget it. And in some ways, I could see, having been a part of the Episcopal Church for my entire life, certainly living in California these past couple of years, how appealing that idea could be. Just like Gilkey's self-evident reasoning to the 9 residents of Block 49. But then I remember that today, this very same day, by number and day, marks the first Sunday 50 years ago that there was a public Sunday Eucharistic celebration by a woman ordained priest in this church. You see, after the controversy following the Philadelphia 11, whose 50th anniversary you may remember happened back in summer, the newly ordained priests were not permitted to exercise their sacramental ministry. And in the midst of that, St. Stephen and the Incarnation Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., invited the Reverend Allison Cheek to preside and celebrate the Eucharist on a Sunday morning, November 10th, in a liturgy that was solemn and joyous. And the parish's priest, the Reverend William Wendt, was brought to disciplinary charges and in an ecclesiastical trial convicted of disobeying a godly admonition from his bishop. Most government systems, even the churches, just aren't designed to prioritize, to countenance such broad realizations of human rights. And I say that knowing that ours somehow still seems to be one of the best at this in the course of human history. That is why I was thankful when in his letter Wednesday, Bishop Austin wrote, quote, "My humble advice is that regardless of how you feel today, remember that the message of God's love in Jesus Christ has never been and will never be fully expressed through the powers and principalities of this world." Or as the psalmist says it today, "Put not your trust in rulers or any child upon the earth, for there is no help in them." So perhaps my second response is to broaden my aperture in search of hope, and to remember that history is full of heartbreak, but also hope, in as much as the beloved community, as you and I, benefit today from the priesthoods of Nancy, Liz, Rebecca, and so many more. Speaking of women, let's come now to our gospel reading. What is your response in any other year to this widow at the temple who gave from her poverty? While we might hear Jesus making her out to be an example in one sense, scholar Sung-Soo Hong suggests we might hear this example not as one of success, but rather one of failure. Failure of what the temple system had become, to tend to and care for, to countenance the widow's well-being. Hong cites language that appears regarding Jesus' teaching on discipleship, where he says, just before they enter into Jerusalem, a couple chapters before, that anyone who leaves one's house, or sisters, or mother, or brother, or father, or children, or fields for my sake, and for the sake of the good news, will be rewarded. But do we really think that the widow is mentioned because the God who gives justice to those who are oppressed, the God who gives food to those who hunger, the God who sets the prisoners free and opens the eyes of the blind, the God who lifts up those who are bowed down, who loves the righteous and cares for the stranger, who sustains the orphan and the widow, but frustrates the way of the wicked? Do we think that she is mentioned there by Jesus because God asked the poor to squeeze just a little more blood out of the only turnip they have? Or is it, Hong wonders, to actually point out that the widow doesn't seem to have any of these things? And further, because Jesus believes that the scribes are devouring the widow's houses. The coins are not like the everything the disciples gave up, Hong writes. No, they're more like an interest-only payment on a loan that can never be paid off, for a debt your husband's untimely death left you to bear. Hong concludes from Jesus' time entering Jerusalem all the way through his prediction of the fall of the temple, that he was rejecting and pushing back against the temple economy. And so, on the one hand, my third response might be to push back against this system myself, something I actually think the vast majority of voters thought they were doing this past election. But then I have to realize that Jesus didn't come. The Word did not become flesh to take down the temple and deliver unto us a better economic system, which may be disappointing for some of us to realize. Just like Jesus didn't come to heal every single last person in need of healing in all of Galilee. So then my response has to straddle a sharp and clear rebuke and criticism of systems of economic exploitation in which I also participate. but also realize that Jesus' project and mission didn't find its ultimate purpose in just getting the economic system right. And so my third response might be to take some stock of how beyond my tithe and my taxes, right, my large sums into whatever treasury, of how I am standing at some kind of substantial or sacrificial cost to myself on the side of the widow and others that I have passively disinherited in the name of progress along the way. This will require my wealth, my work, and I say my wisdom, but probably the wisdom of many others. But also that I figure out who the widows are in my story without Jesus having to so obviously point them out to me. Those who are down and counted out. And on this, I want to close with a couple of down and counted out folks who shared an exchange in a tough moment on the way to destroy a symbol of politics that had animated folks like the ones in Block 49, that had restricted the sacramental ministry of the first female priests of this church, that had failed to tend to or care for the widow. Folks who had decided scarcity, hostility, revenge, and violence was the way to exercise power. Instead of what folks like Liddell showed us, folks like Allison Cheek and William Wendt. And if you look around for a moment, even folks who are next to you in the pews this morning, with whom we, beloved, are being called to decide abundance, hospitality, forgiveness, and peacemaking are the better way. And these two who are down and counted out do it with the whole of Middle Earth on the line. Frodo pulling back his sword from the edge of Sam's neck says to him, "I can't do this, Sam." And Sam, looking in despair at the distance, says, "I know. It's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here. But we are. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered, full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way in which it was when such bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. And when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't, because they were holding on to something. Frodo, lying there on the ground, gets out. "What are we holding on to, Sam?" As Sam walks over to him, he lifts Frodo up off the ground, and he looks into his eyes. that there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and that it's worth